Good evening, everybody. We're just letting in all the folks who are showing up in our waiting room. And we're so pleased that people could join us this evening for this special time together. My name is Judy Code with Pax Christi USA. It's great to see folks. And I think we can go ahead and get started. Before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to ask Michelle, actually, if you could just keep an eye on the waiting room and let people in as you see them.
Yes, you got it.
This week is the World Council of Churches has for several years now designated this time of year, mid-September, as the week of prayer for peace in Israel-Palestine. So this event tonight was specifically chosen to fall during that week. So we're just going to start with a prayer from the World Council of Churches. A word of prayer. God of love and justice, we ask you to open our hearts for empathy for the suffering on all sides. For those in Gaza who are in darkness in the face of death and destruction, hear their cries. For those in the West Bank who are victims of settler violence and theft of land, strengthen them in their struggle for justice. For those who are held in Gaza as hostages, for their desperate families who fear the worst, for those who mourn the death of their loved ones, send light into their darkness. Open the door for a release of all hostages and all those unjustly detained. We bring before you hate and division around the world as a reaction to the war in the Holy Land. Hateful acts against Arabs and Muslims being labeled as terrorists while seeking a just peace. Attacks on Jews who are falsely held responsible for the actions of the government of Israel. Send your spirit of love and reconciliation into their hearts, into our hearts, so we have the courage to uphold the sanctity of life, see the beauty of all human beings created in your image, and overcome all hate. God of reconciliation, send your spirit of wisdom and prudence into the hearts of those in power, that a just and sustainable peace with room for a good life for both Palestinians and Israelis may become possible. Amen. So we're really pleased that three of our great Pax Christi members could be with us this evening. I think, as folks know, there have been a few delegations that have started heading to Israel Palestine to stand in solidarity with Palestinians there. Our three speakers tonight all participated in a delegation about a month ago. I'm going to introduce all three of them right now, and then they're going to take turns giving their presentations this evening. So I'm going to start with, the first one is Jessica Sun. Jessica is a second-generation Chinese American from Virginia and an experienced local volunteer community organizer of 8 years. She converted to Catholicism after 10 years as identifying as an agnostic. She finds a dear sense of belonging in the spaces of zealous, gospel-led advocacy, that would be Pax Christi, and action for just peace and nonviolence. She has a BS in computer science from Virginia Tech and worked in the banking industry as a software engineer for 5 years. She is currently discerning religious life as a Catholic sister, and she is on the leadership team of our Pax Christi Young Adult Caucus. So thank you, Jessica. And we have another PKIAC member. Bob Shine is a longtime member of Pax Christi. He was actually chair of the council a couple of rounds ago. And he actually helped form the Young Adult Caucus. Bob works with New Ways Ministry, which focuses on the reform and renewal of the Catholic Church, particularly for the LGBTQ plus community. And then finally, we have Scott Wright, who many folks have known for many years because he has been a a very constant and committed presence in the justice world for a long time. He's worked with faith-based organizations for justice, peace, and solidarity in Latin America for 30 years. He worked in the Christian-based community and with pastoral ministry of accompaniment with refugees and displaced people in El Salvador during the Civil War in the 80s. He has visited Iraq with Voices in the Wilderness and Palestine a couple of times with Pax Christi, and most recently with the Stones Cry Out delegation, and then this most recent one in August. He's worked with survivors of torture and with migrants along the U.S.-Mexico border. And he lives here in D.C. with his wonderful wife, Jean Stoken, who also many folks know, and their daughter, Maura, and Maura's baby, Clara Rose. So I'm going to take myself off, and I'm going to leave it to Jessica, Bob, and Scott to lead us through their program.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so heading right into it, the name of our delegation and our itinerary given by our host, Sabeel, was Jerusalem Beyond Boundaries, a tour for true understanding. Here you see a picture of our whole delegation, 12 U.S. Christian leaders. We here are pictured outside of the Balata refugee camp in Nablus, Palestine. Nablus had been historically one of the biggest cities of trade and the breadbasket of the area of historic Palestine. Balata refugee camp today holds 8 generations of internally displaced Palestinian refugees, and it is a ghetto where weapons are being tested in extreme residential areas that are overcrowded. Leading the tour of the Balata refugee camp by the town leader of the camp, we were left with smiles and a lot of tears too as we walked through the rubble. And on the flip side of this, it grieves me to share that 3 a.m. that night, the day that we left, Israeli tanks rolled in at 3 a.m. at the exact place where we are standing in this picture and shot randomly throughout the square and into the residential areas you see in the back, killing five civilians. So as we head into this presentation and we share more about what we saw, there's just 2 disclaimers I want to quickly share that, and the first is to get most of your information about Palestine from Palestinians, not from us and not from US media. In addition, throughout this presentation, there will be some images of weaponry and occupation army soldiers. So I want to share in this heavy time, in this time of an ongoing genocide, that who we were hosted by and just 2 of the groups that we met with. So our hosts were Sabeel. Sabeel is the ecumenical center for Palestinian liberation theology. So Sabeel is Arabic for the way, and some of you may know that Christianity in the earliest days was called the way. So that's where Sabeel comes from. So that's just a sign, a picture of their sign outside their headquarters in Jerusalem on the left, and on the right there is the famous trifecta of nonviolence heroes that you may recognize of Dorothy Day, Mahatma Gandhi, and MLK. That was hanging inside Sabeel headquarters in Jerusalem. Now, here is a experience that we had shortly before reaching as close to the militarized border of Gaza as we could get. Some of you may have heard that our delegation was able to have a nonviolent prayer, disruptive nonviolent prayer outside of the Gaza border, outside of the wall there. And so on our way, I want to share an experience that we had with Omar, who was our Sabeel delegation leader. For me, one of the greatest takeaways from this trip was getting to witness Omar in action. It is an understatement, in my opinion, to say that Omar is a master of nonviolence. And the scenario I'm about to share goes into a detail as to why I believe that. So here's our tourist bus. We are going into a militarized area where typically they expect no one to be there. We are in a tourist van. We are in a place as we're getting further and further from regular residential life and into places where there are tanks and just a bunch of military stuff. And we passed by one military base, and our tourist van stops. Our Palestinian driver is sweating bullets. And we stop outside this checkpoint. And Omar, a Palestinian Christian, and our host, tells all of us to stay on the bus. So you see this picture here in the right, bottom right, is a picture of one of us taking a picture of Omar who has got off the bus. And he goes to the officer and he asks the officer for directions. Just like, oh, we're lost. Could you please tell us where we need to go or something like that, asking for direction. And the soldier responds to Omar saying, I'm not from around here. And then Omar says in response to the soldier at this military checkpoint right outside Gaza, in response to his answer of, I'm not from around here, Omar says, isn't that the whole conflict? And they joke about it, or at least Omar was able to smile about it with this soldier. And this is just one of many instances where Omar's integrity and courage in the face of a lifetime of occupation, of a brutal occupation of over 70 years, um, taught me so much. All right, so that was on our way leaving the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is one of the closest places you can get to Gaza right now as a civilian. And so we had left from this place for the Kerem Shalom crossing. And before we went outside the wall of the militarized area of Gaza, we were here. And we were having an interfaith prayer service at this crossing. You see here in the picture, you see Omar, our fearless leader. You see us, our delegation of Christians on this delegation. And you also see rabbis for human rights. One of the rabbis pictured there is with a guitar, as well as the woman next to him. And there's also a Muslim sheikh from a nearby village. So this was a really prayerful, beautiful experience that our delegation got to do. And in the bottom left, you'll see some of you recognize Eli McCarthy, but there he is, and Scott is right there with him on the ground. Being so close to Gaza, we had heard some motor shells. We believe there were motor shells, and a siren went off, and we all had to hit the ground. And the Israeli rabbis for human rights were walking us through what to expect. And so we heard the sound of our US taxpayers at work, taxpayer dollars at work, and most likely causing the deaths of more Palestinians in Gaza. So this is the setting of which we met rabbis for human rights. And I especially want to share the story of Avi here, one of the rabbis for human rights. He is someone who grew up in the Kerem Shalom crossing area. This is where he was born and raised. His parents are from Lebanon and Syria, and he's an Israeli rabbi. He is a personal survivor of the Hamas attacks, the Gaza ghetto uprising of October 7th. He is a personal survivor of that terrorist attack. He had friends die on October 7th. He had family members die on October 7th. He described to us the harrowing encounter of hiding in his home with the lights off, behind a couch, trying to be as quiet as possible. Even before October 7th, Avi has been a peacemaker. He believes in a better future for all people between the river to the sea. He talked to us about a time when there was no border between Gaza, a huge city, Khan Yunis being one of the biggest cities within it, and there's no borders between Krum Shalom and where he grew up and Gaza. And there was open trade, people walked freely. And growing up as a peacemaker, as someone who saw Palestinians as human, he thought this was great to have that open border. After October 7th, a few of his fellow Israelis told him, see, why are you a peacemaker? Why did you try? There's peace is not going to be possible. You can't reason with them. It's kind of denigration and this dehumanization of Palestinians that's so common in Israeli society. And Avai responded to them, I absolutely still believe in peace. And he was here speaking with us as a rabbi for human rights who has been beat up, spat on, cursed at, received death threats from his fellow Israelis, still believing and acting for a peaceful, just peace for all people living between the river to the sea. That was an extremely powerful witness for us to experience and be a part of. And I wanted to share Avai's story with you and a little bit about the work of rabbis, human rights, and other Israeli peace organizations that are a small but steady minority that continue to believe in coexistence, co-celebration, and as one Israeli activist put it, co-resistance to militarization. Next, I wanted to share about the Armenian quarter. So in there, first I want to give some context on Armenia, the flag you're seeing here. So Armenia is in 301 AD is actually the first state in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion. So this is talking about 301 AD. Armenia is the first ever Christian state. So this is a little bit about the significance of Armenia to the Christian community. Here you see pictured kind of a broad expanse. And this is at the highest part of the old city of Jerusalem. So, and this specific area is known as the Cows Quarter. So a little bit more about that. The Armenian Quarter is one of the four living quarters, the four sectors of the walled old city of Jerusalem. And this specific quarter, this specific area for Armenians, Armenian Christians, can be traced back all the way to the 5th century. Over 1,500 years of history in this exact place that you see on the screen right now. This area, which is known as the Cow's Garden, makes up 25% of the entire Armenian Quarter and is the largest open land area in the Old City. And it is currently under threat, especially with increased attacks after October 7th by violent Israeli settlers or guards. We met with an organization here called Save the Ark, and I'm going to share a little bit about them in the next slide. But this specific area, which is at the highest part of Old City Jerusalem, an extremely, extremely coveted area of real estate, has historically served as a sanctuary for pilgrims and for Armenian refugees after the Armenian genocide. So this is the history of the place. And you'll see some fences there. You'll see some kind of furniture thrown over there. And you'll see a flag kind of on top of this stone mountain. And the reason why that flag was placed there is that although this is the highest point of Old City Jerusalem, the Armenian flag is even higher than that. It's still standing. It's still there, despite the illegal attempts to take and kind of Judaize the Old City of Jerusalem that has always been multi-faith and respectful of all three Abrahamic religions. So here you see Zerchuk. Now, Zerchuk Balyan is a leader of Save the Ark. Zerchuk himself, is Armenian and culturally they're very Christian, but he shared to us candidly about how he had fallen away from the faith, the Christian faith, for about 10 years or so, and just in recent years had really come back to Christ, to God, in his own relationship And so that's kind of where we find Sirchuk as the increasing attacks are occurring on his home, where he was born and raised. Sirchuk is the leader of the youth-led struggle to save the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem's Old City. It stands in this area under threat from Israeli developers and those who want to do away with the city's religious diversity. Sirchuk spoke to us about his efforts to mobilize the local Armenian community, especially at a time where there's so much intimidation going on Christians, on Christian clergy within the Old City of Jerusalem, to take a stand, to put your neck out there, to put your body at risk with even though you're being attacked by people with weapons, takes a lot of courage. Sirchuk and other Armenian Christians who met with us spoke about crosses being torn down by Israelis who are going through the city and in acts of intimidation and in attempts to Judaize the old city of Jerusalem. He talked to us about starting a WhatsApp group, I think within the last year or so, just seeing the need to protect their land, their rightful and legal land, from invasions and people who are trying to take it over. And he talked to us about the WhatsApp group and gathering people in for this important cause to remember their history of over 1,500 years on this exact spot that has survived so many occupations, from the Ottomans to the Israeli occupation today, and how they would share with one another what was going on. Our Armenian community would stay close in that way. If there was an attack coming on, and they were going to try to tear down the barricade that they had put up to try to defend with their bodies, because the police were not going. The Israeli police were not interested in not answering their calls for help to protect the law. That they were going to put out a WhatsApp message if attackers were coming with knives and bats. And within 5 minutes, over 200 people would be in this square that you see coming to protect their land. And this effort, Save the Ark, is this youth-led movement by a few brave souls who believe and know in Sirchuk's words that Jerusalem is for everybody. At the end of the presentation, we had the chance to offer our blessings to Sirchuk, to promise that we will act and not just pray for a just peace and to save the Armenian quarter, which is so important to Christians.
Jessica, this has been great. I'm wondering if it's time to check in with Bob.
Yeah, I think I realize I can't see the clock actually when I'm showing my screen. So we can go ahead and move through this. So here is just a picture of us at the militarized border with some more signs, and this is my roommate, Mercy, who was wonderful and is the network of evangelicals from the Middle East and Peace Catalyst International. And she had led tours to Bethlehem for a long time, but in hope and in prayer for an end to all violence. Take it away, Bob.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for showing up to this conversation. Good to see so many friends and fellow journeyers, many of you who have been organizing around Palestine in DC and other places I know. And I see Kelly's here, who was on our delegation. So thanks for being here. We're behind, so I think I'm going to just say one quick thing, and then I'm going to pass it over to Scott, who I think has better things to say. One of the things I was going to talk about was the nature of the delegation that we were on, in that, some of you probably have done educational solidarity delegations in the past in different places. The hope right now is that this delegation and subsequent delegations with Sabeel will not only just be sort of moments of education and encounter, but that some of them will take on and explore how to do nonviolence, solidarity, protective presence work, act as de-escalators and disruptors and where that's possible. So my pitch is there will be more of these delegations, and I think Scott may say something, but I know I'm already also in conversation with Sabeel about future delegations that would have more of an active nonviolence focus. If that is of interest to you, please get in touch. And really what I want to pass it over to now is Scott, who will talk a little bit about what we can all be doing on this side to advocate for an end to the atrocities. So thanks for being here, Scott.
Scott, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
And I'm unmuted. Okay. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Jessica. We were 12 persons on this delegation, and some of us knew each other. We were I think we were 5 or 6 Catholics, people from other Christian denominations, but quite diverse, intergenerational. And, it was by the end of the 5, 6 days together, we really bonded in a way, as well as we bonded with Sabeel and our host, Omar. And I think it's a testimony, when we all shared, we weren't quite certain what we were going into because of the threat of a regional war, because of the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the settler violence in the West Bank. But it was that shared space of vulnerability and that accompaniment of vulnerable Palestinian communities, I think, that was a real powerful experience of mutual solidarity, I would say. So what I'm going to do is just, I don't want to repeat anything, but just simply to summarize maybe and give some thoughts about what we can do together next. And so one is just a reminder, today is day 349 of the war in Gaza. And you can see, I don't have to repeat or read what you see there. But, to think, and I mean, social media is so powerful, it's overwhelming. But to think of, I mean, I'm thinking of an analogy of Black Lives Matter, how the community, African American community and allies came together over the, horrible death of an African American sister or brother. So if we can imagine the pain and grieving of each family over these past 349 days, and you'll see toward the bottom there 160,000 indirect deaths. And that's from a medical journal, The Lancet, that said they've studied conflicts for decades. It's a medical peer-reviewed journal, but they've studied where the direct conflict, deaths in a conflict, you can multiply by 4 in terms of indirect consequences, basically of disease and starvation. And both of those are increasingly present in Gaza. So what we heard, we of course did not go into Gaza. We were at the border, as Jessica shared. But what we heard is the war is moving increasingly, and even during our delegation, toward the West Bank. And the settler violence is becoming increasingly aggressive, fatal against vulnerable Palestinian farmers and communities and Bedouin communities. So actually, these 4 frames on this slide is from Jewish Voice for Peace. I think it's important to say, we met with Rabbis for Human Rights, we met with families of the hostages. And here in the United States, we've, developed many good relationships with other organizations across religious traditions, and Jewish Voice for Peace is certainly one of them. But here is an acknowledgement from them that what's happening in Gaza is genocidal, and that violence is increasingly now moving into the West Bank. And some communities that we visited, a Bedouin community, a refugee camp in Nablus, just days later is when the largest Israeli attack on the West Bank in 2 decades took place. So we witnessed already the increasing violence moving toward that invasion of the Israeli Defense Forces or occupation forces. And a theme that came up is, well, who's really in charge? Is it the settlers or is it the Israeli army? And it was difficult at times, it seemed to be a collusion between the two. But we also heard on at least a couple of occasions from the Israeli Defense Forces telling us, we can't protect you. If you go forward to this community or past this checkpoint, you're on your own in terms of settler violence. So that's that same picture that Jessica shared with us. But it's just a reminder, I think there's 6 million Israelis in Israel. There's 6 million Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories, but there's 8 million plus Palestinian refugees in neighboring countries. And their right to return and desire to return is at the heart of any kind of movement toward a just peace and reconciliation. And to look at that bottom, in Gaza, most of the 2.1 million people in Gaza are refugees. And they are without any kind of assistance from the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Since the US led an international effort to cut off funding to them. So what does settler violence look like? The 2 pictures on the left. So we visited a community just outside Bethlehem called Al-Makur in Beit Jala. And Alice Casilla, we met with her under a tent, provisional tent, with her family had set up because 5 years ago, her family restaurant was destroyed by settlers. And at this moment, her house had been attacked. They were forced to leave. They set up a temporary tent. And when we visited them just a few days before this bottom picture, you can see the Israeli Defense Forces in the background. And these are also persons, Palestinians and Israelis in solidarity with the family and against the settlers who came to make a statement, you cannot remove this family from their land. And on the right, those 2 pictures, Bob made mention, or at least alluded to, a community that we visited, Jamal, in the Jordan Valley. And they had physically been threatened, violently been threatened the night or 2 before. We only met with the men from the Bedouin community. The children and the women had been terrorized and had gone ahead. They were relocating from their lands where they lived for 30 years. And they wanted to keep their sheep and the feed for the sheep. That's why the men remained behind. So there we encountered both settlers as well as Israeli Defense Forces. But then it was clear there was no kind of protection for us from the Israeli Defense Forces. They were anxious for us to leave. Eventually we did, and we made statements protests to the State Department, the U.S. Embassy, that we think did have a temporary effect, allowing the men at least to relocate, but they were forcibly displaced from their lands. And it's important, we had a little training online from Sabeel and some of their allies, Palestinian allies, on nonviolence. And I was really struck, by one statement made, that nonviolence is not simply kind of, I think we tend to think of it, well, we'll undertake this campaign or this public action or this civil disobedience. But for Palestinians, simply to remain on their land, simply to get up in the morning, have a meal with their children, send their children off to school, try to go to work, is a form of nonviolence because they're refusing to leave their native land under extreme threat of violence. And but they do have their heroes and heroines. And these three are three people that we met with. Isa was written up in the New York Times in May as a Palestinian Gandhi. He's been repeatedly, I was on a delegation in March, we met with him. In May, he was repeatedly beaten up and hospitalized after settler violence. We met with him in August. Iyad, if some of you have seen or will see, it's worth seeing, 5 Broken Cameras, is the story of their 20-year struggle to remain on their land, and a campaign of nonviolence. And Daoud Nasser from the Tent of Nations, they're surrounded by Israeli settlements and checkpoints. Some roads of access have been blocked and new ones giving settlers access have been built just in the months between March and August. But, they shared with us, this is part of their statement. We refuse to be victims. We refuse to hate. We refuse to be enemies. We believe justice will triumph. From the river to the sea. Jessica mentioned that beautiful story from Rabbi Avi. So, in our context and oftentimes in the media, that phrase, from the river to the sea, is used to say, well, it's the Palestinians want to drive the Jews into the sea, or the Palestinians will say, well, the Jews want to drive us, ethnically cleanse off of our land and take over all of the land of Israel and the occupied territories. But Rabbi Avi used it in this beautiful way of, no, we need to learn to live together as Israelis and Palestinians on this land with equal rights and equal dignity. How that will happen seems incredibly difficult. But those three groups on the right are Israelis and Palestinians working together, and many for decades, but standing together after our prayer, interfaith prayer and vigil and protest at the Gaza border. We went to the closest town to the border, and with standing together with Palestinians and Israelis, packed food for Gaza. So 5 trucks would go in, supposedly a couple days later. But before October 7th, 500 trucks were going into Gaza. So it's a drop in the bucket, but it's an important symbol. The Parents Circle, in just the end of this month, Pax Christi International in Rome will recognize and give a human rights award to the Parents Circle. These are Palestinian and Israeli families who have lost loved ones over the past 20 years. And they recently met with Pope Francis, who gave a very beautiful recognition of their work. and combatants for peace. So ex-combatants from both Israelis and Palestinians. Actually, when we went to the tent where Alice Kisia was, her house had been threatened. They were encamped, trying to go back to their home. Outside were combatants for peace in an act of solidarity with the family, resisting the settler violence. And then finally, or near finally, to remember these three, someone posted this and said, well, what do they have in common? They're all US citizens or Palestinian Americans, some of them, and they've all been assassinated. Rachel Corrie, 21 years ago, trying to stop a bulldozer from demolishing a Palestinian home. Shireen, her niece was part of the Sabeel team, was with us the entire week. Shireen was a journalist who was shot by at point blank by an Israeli sniper 2 years ago. And Isa Noor, again, a US citizen, dual citizen, Turkey and the US, was killed, again, participating in a peaceful, nonviolent protest, but the protest was over. And a half hour later, she was standing under a tree talking with somebody and killed by an Israeli sniper. So they really are our window, in a sense. Are these lives worth more than any Palestinian life or any Israeli life? But there's been no justice for any of those three from the US government. So what's going on and what can we do? I'll end with this. So, there are two deep, deep narratives of suffering in conflict. The Holocaust and what the Palestinians call the Nakba, which was the ethnic cleansing, the destruction of 500 Palestinian villages, and the removal of 750,000, most of the Palestinian population at that time, forced to go into exile. Palestinians will say, well, the Holocaust happened on European soil. We had nothing to do with it, and we're being punished for it. Respect for international law. So we heard also from Palestinians, don't talk to us about international law or human rights. We see what the US says and does in Ukraine, and we see what the US does and says and does not say and does not do with regard to Gaza and the West Bank and Palestine. Defend human rights at the very least. But, 120 people are killed a day, 41,000 in Gaza in almost 1 year. Two peoples, a two-state solution looks very difficult this time because of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. A one-state solution would have to be, equal dignity, equal rights for Palestinians, and they would be a majority, especially if the refugees return. So how will it happen? And then finally, nurture the seeds of nonviolence, the stories that Palestinians tell. There's two beautiful films. The most recent one, Where Olive Trees Weep, but they're worth looking at. What can we do? At least we can change US policy, an arms embargo. Next week, Senator Bernie Sanders will introduce a resolution to hold up the $20 billion that President Biden authorized about a month ago to go to Israel. So we can support that effort in the Senate and Senator Sanders' bill to hold up, to block that arms shipment. Permanent ceasefire, continue to call for that. That's not the root cause. It won't end anything, but Palestinians will say, at least let us breathe. BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. I mean, that worked around the campaign to end apartheid in South Africa. It's a non-violent and a very powerful way to contribute toward a solution, a just peace. And support the return of Palestinian refugees. At home, we must not give in to the opposition that says, to oppose Israel is anti-Semitic, to be pro-Palestinian is anti-Semitic. I mean, Jewish Voices for Peace, Rabbis for Human Rights, many other Jews will say that's simply not the case. We have to oppose anti-Semitism, we have to oppose Islamophobia, the dehumanization of Palestinians, but also Christian nationalism, which is almost as powerful a lobby, if not greater than the Jewish lobby AIPAC. And then finally, as Bob said, join a delegation. Our delegation was sponsored by Christians for a Ceasefire. The October and December delegations are already organizing. You can join that. Sabeel has a November delegation. And then this is the invitation letter that we received. It's still valid. It's still an appeal to all of us and will be over the coming weeks, months, and possibly years. Stand in solidarity with us. Be a voice for the voices. Help us amplify the call for peace and justice. Embody Christ's mission. And Reverend Munter Isaac, who was just on tour in the US, Omar Harame from Sabeel, who was our host, and Rifat Kassis from Kairos, Palestine, signed that letter. So thank you so very much.
Thank you all. We have a couple of minutes before we're going to take a little break before we start Pax Mass. I really appreciate all three of you. It's a really great privilege and a wonderful thing to be able to travel and physically be in solidarity with our family in other parts of the world. And I'm so grateful that the three of you had the chance to do that and to share your experience with us. I did put a invitation for questions. We have one. Margaret Mary asks, how do we get this information out? This is great information that people need to know about. How can we get more publicity on this and more in the mainstream press? For instance, our buddy Anderson Cooper. So I don't know if anybody wants to chime in on that one. It is a hard call.
Well, don't get discouraged. I mean, it's easy, but I mean, I'm heartened just because so many people, keep going. And I think there's an added value, the more we keep going, and particularly, I mean, Palestinians who either have been living under these circumstances for generations or who are here in the US, they keep going. And I mean, they do, the ones, people we know, at least in the Palestinian Christian community, they're an example for us, I think, of what it really means to be a faithful, passionate, committed Christian. So, I think the more we reach out to the Palestinian community, the more we reach out to each other, the more we kind of look between the lines, not to believe the mainstream press. I mean, there are some good stories, but we need Palestinian sources, as Jessica suggested, and they're available.
I definitely want to echo everything Scott said and also add that Friends of Sabeel North America has an excellent array of resources to begin, to join. Myself and a few others, we're also part of Christians for Free Palestine, Direct Actions. But wherever you are, whatever your starting point, there are lots of people dreaming together, acting together. Omar, our fearless guide, that actually just said straight out to us, don't pray for us if you're not going to do anything. So taking that to heart and the inspiration of the Palestinian Christians rooted in this universal ethic of nonviolence, to think and reflect for myself every day. When I say I profess discipleship of Jesus, no matter the cost, what am I doing for my whole family?
Bob, I don't know if you want to chime in on any of if you see questions in the chat.
Sure. I'll jump in, Mary Ellen's question about the claim that Israel has the right to defend itself. So I think getting the framing right when discussing the question of Palestine is important. If you frame it as a conflict between two sides, you're going to get to the wrong, or a solution doesn't work. If you frame it as a conflict between two legitimate countries, you're going to get it. You're not going to get a solution. I think the framing is getting it right, and that framing is colonization. That this is Palestinian land that Zionists have come in and tried to expel Palestinians from. And this is not a war or a conflict between two sides. This is one people who have a legitimate right to the land and another people who are an occupying power. And so when people say Israel has a right to defend itself, at least I would say that's a very that is a very easily challenged claim, because do not the Palestinians also have the right to defend themselves? I think for someone like me, the commitment to nonviolence would say violence is not an answer, but under international law in Gaza and the West Bank, Israel is an occupying power, and you can legitimately resist with arms, whether we agree morally or not. You can resist an occupying power as an oppressed people. So this is a very, I think, important claim to begin to push back on, which is just Israel has a right to self-defense. That may be the case within the territories of the state of Israel, but in the occupied West Bank and in occupied Gaza, that's not actually the case. So I guess I would encourage you to, whenever questions like that come up, shift the framing from this is a war between two sides to this is a colonizing side who is a massive power with the backing of a superpower, and people who are rightly resisting that occupation and colonization. We can discuss what means of resistance are better or worse, legitimate or illegitimate, but shifting your framing on how you think about this, how you think about what's happening, for me and for many, is like the key to understanding how it could actually become a place of peace and justice in a long, in time. But if you think about it as just two warring sides, you're never going to get to actually finding peace, because you're never actually dealing with the problem at hand.
Thank you, Bob and Jessica and Scott. We have one raised hand, and so Margaret, Mary, I'm gonna ask you to unmute and you can ask your question, and then we're gonna after that we're gonna take a break, and we're gonna start Pax Mass at 8 well, in 5 minutes, so 8 o'clock on the East Coast. So Margaret, Mary, if you can unmute yourself, ask your question, and then we'll take a break.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I know it's not very diplomatic to say it, but these are Nazi tactics, because remember in the Second World War, when the resistance would go and kill a Nazi soldier or something, they would retaliate by saying, we're going to kill 100 of you. And that's what they did. And I don't hear that argument very much. That, I mean, 1,200 were kidnapped by Hamas, and now 40,000 are dead. I mean, those are Nazi tactics. Is there not any proportionality? I mean, it's absolutely disgraceful. But I don't hear that called out very much. But then, and then the other thing I don't hear was in the paper once or twice. Jared Kushner and his real estate people are already planning hotels to make Gaza Miami Beach. Now that's documented. I'm not making that up. Why don't we put that out there again and again and again? They have no intention of stopping. These people are really evil. I don't know why they call themselves Jews, because there's nothing in Jewish Hebrew scripture. And they're also blood related because God is the father of Ishmael too. And so these are the descendants of Israel. So this is fratricide. They're killing their own brothers. This is not what God told them to do. And I don't hear that talked about very much because, and I have Jewish friends and they don't even know the history. They really don't. They don't talk about it in their families. And I said, how can you expect people that you have subjugated for 75 years to tell you thank you? Oh, well, we didn't know that. Maybe not, but a lot of people from the German families and immigrants, they have not talked about the Holocaust. They don't bring up history, but I think we could do more of that because there is a history of that kind of subjugation and Nazi tactics. And I think that most of us would be afraid to say it in public. Oh, you're anti-Semitic. But the fact is, that's what the Nazis did. And I think Israel has learned very well from their captivity in the Second World War. It's a real shame.
Margaret Mary, thank you. And you bring up some important points, and we're going to keep trying to work on this together. I'm glad, Bob and Jessica and Scott all mentioned some of the other great organizations that are working together. We're going to try to keep spreading the word. We're going to take a break now. I'm going to pause the recording. I'm going to invite everybody just to stretch your legs for a second, and we're going to come back and join Father Chris Ponette, who is going to lead us in this quarter's Pax Mass. So thank you again. Appreciate it. Don't go anywhere. Don't turn off your Zoom. We'll come back in a couple of minutes. Thanks, everybody.